Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Mara Koza lives nearly 30 miles outside of Johannesburg, in South Africa's third largest township, Katlehong. She's 38 years old and pregnant. She lives in a community of more than 400,000 people, almost all of whom are Black. Just over a quarter of them, including Mara, live in homes constructed out of corrugated iron sheets with no access to electricity. That's Mara speaking with Ntando Thukwana, who covers economic and government affairs in South Africa for Bloomberg. She told Ntando that for most of her life, she's been a steady supporter of the African National Congress Party, the party of Nelson Mandela, which has led her country since 1994. Mandela took power after a peaceful toppling of apartheid in South Africa when Mara was just 8 years old.
38.
Mandela promised a better life under the ANC, access to healthcare, education, and employment opportunities.
We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination.
Mara has the ANC party colors hanging in her window. Like so many South Africans, she's believed in the party for decades. It's won every election in South Africa since Mandela's initial victory. Its consistent majority has meant it could enact many of its reforms without much pushback. But that decades-long majority for the ANC could be coming to an end. Now, even voters like Mara are unsure. Next week, South Africans head into an election where the ANC's current leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, is facing some stiff competition.
Which shows you the kind of dynamic and the kind of despondency that people have about the ANC's rule over the last 30 years.
Ntando says there's growing disappointment with the party, especially among Black South Africans, who feel that its promises haven't fully come true. South Africa has the most industrialized economy in Africa, but for years, economic growth has been stagnant. Its official unemployment rate of 33% is among the worst in the world, and there are huge racial disparities. The unemployment rate for Black South Africans is more than 3 times higher than it is for white South Africans. Today on the show, South Africa is at a turning point. 30 years after Nelson Mandela rose to power on a platform of equality, peace, and prosperity, the party he headed is facing serious challengers. As the people head to the polls next week, they'll be casting their votes for the party they hope can best tackle the severe problems the country is facing. And the ANC looks poised to lose its outright majority, something once unthinkable for the party that saved the country from apartheid. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. South Africa's African National Congress Party has been elected over and over again for the past 3 decades. That's thanks in large part to its association with Nelson Mandela. And Bloomberg's Ntando Thukwana says, life is better for South Africans now than it was during apartheid. But that doesn't mean things have turned out exactly as the ANC promised.
The ANC is the party that liberated South Africa out of white minority rule in 1994. And it's the reason why so many people believed in the party then. And when it ran its campaigns in 1994, it basically promised a better life for all. And it promised to widen access to healthcare, education, employment opportunities, and also make South Africa's economy more inclusive. And some of those promises have materialized, but not fully.
Today, nearly 2/3 of the population live in poverty. And despite the ANC's efforts, South Africa's stark racial divides remain. When the party first took over, as many as 7 million South Africans were either homeless or living in informal settlements. So the ANC made housing access a key part of its platform. They enshrined adequate housing as a right in South Africa's new constitution and pledged to build about 1 million subsidized homes and electrify even more. But Mara Koza, the woman from Katlehong, is one of many South Africans who have waited years for housing under a government-led program. And when her turn finally came, all she was allocated was a vacant plot of land. Does she feel like the government has failed her?
In some ways she does, because She has been given a plot of land where she can one day build a house for herself and her children. And to her, she would not have been able to do that for herself. And she feels appreciative and grateful that the ANC government was at least able to do that for her. And also her community members also depend on the social welfare grants. But on the other hand, she says that they have been promised electricity, for instance, and it's not been connected yet, which basically means that they are in the dark.
But housing for all isn't the only campaign promise the ANC has struggled to fulfill. Ntando says educational opportunities are lacking too.
If you look at the education sector, most of the public schools in township areas, and those are very densely populated areas, you'll find that schools are overcrowded to a point that it affects the learning outcomes of children in township areas or previously disadvantaged areas.
According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, only 7% of South African adults have received an education beyond the high school level. And those gaps in the school system have helped contribute to a mounting unemployment crisis in South Africa. Why are these unemployment rates so high, and what does that look like for families in South Africa?
The basis of the reason why South Africa is struggling with unemployment is because there isn't enough economic growth to begin with. And what that does is creates a need for social welfare. And it's not sustainable because it means that the country is actually spending more on consumption and isn't spending enough on productive areas of the economy. And that is really a huge problem.
The government has also struggled to provide basic services like electricity. The state-owned electricity company, Eskom, was tasked with fixing the crisis. But its budget has been depleted, and it has faced accusations of corruption, mismanagement, and even sabotage. As a result, blackouts have been a fact of life in the country for more than a decade.
Eskom has not been able to supply power. It hasn't been able to fill the demand coming from households and businesses. And if you think about it, there's a historical context that comes with it, because when the ANC did come into power, they inherited a power system that only serviced a select few. And as time went by, obviously they promised to provide housing and electrify those houses, which means that the demand had increased, but they had not invested enough to make sure that they expand their network of equipment.
The combination of these challenges, housing, education, unemployment, and power, create major drags on the country's entire economy. And finding the money to fix those things is not easy. Could you just give us a sense of the country's economic temperature given all of these problems?
If you look at South Africa's debt levels, they throttle South Africa's capability to spend on productive sectors of the economy. And that's the reason why it can't actually do important stuff like grow the economy and create employment, because it's spending on interest payments. And that's a hefty amount that you could be redirecting to other parts of South Africa's spending needs. So, yeah, South Africa's public finances are sitting at basically a precarious position.
Ntando says this has all led many voters to become disillusioned with the ANC. Polls suggest that the party could get less than 50% of the vote next week.
A lot of these people are actually conflicted if you talk to them. They're at odds about how they feel about the ANC. It's like the ANC has put them in a very hard spot where they are now being forced to choose between the ANC and someone else. And many of them actually don't feel like voting for someone else. I mean, I spoke to someone else who basically said to him, there's no other party.
But other parties have emerged to challenge the ANC's majority this year in what has become the most hotly contested election in South Africa since apartheid ended. After the break, who are these challengers? And what are they promising for the future of South Africa? In South Africa, voters elect parties, not politicians, and the parties choose their own leaders. When South African voters head to the polls on May 29th, they'll face a difficult choice: whether to re-elect the African National Congress, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, or put their support behind one of several other political parties. Ntando Thukwana, who covers South Africa's economy and government for Bloomberg, says there have never been so many competitive candidates.
What you're seeing now for the first time is a long list of new entrants coming to the fore.
There are three main parties challenging the ANC: the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and the Umkhonto we Sizwe Party. What are the different directions for South Africa's future that these different candidates and parties are promising?
The ANC currently is promising things that it has promised before, to make the economy more inclusive, to increase employment levels in the country. And if you look at a party like the Economic Freedom Fighters, that is a left-leaning party. Its stance is really one of extremism and radicalism.
The Economic Freedom Fighters are led by Julius Malema.
This is a province where a lot of people don't have land, and they live like sardines in the squatter camps.
He's only 43 and used to lead the ANC's youth wing. He's long focused on the ANC's failure to address the country's stark racial inequality, with headline-grabbing moves like calling for wide-scale land redistribution from the white minority to the black majority.
And then there's a new entrant on the block, the Umkhonto we Sizwe Party, whose party leader is former president of the South African government, Jacob Zuma.
Two-thirds majority, yona ezokwenza.
Zuma is 82. He served as South Africa's president for years under the ANC, before being jailed on contempt of court charges amid a massive corruption probe. But Zuma managed to get out of jail early and is running under the umbrella of a new political party. He's technically disqualified from holding a position in parliament, but he remains popular with his followers, and so his candidacy could prove a spoiler for the ANC. The main opposition is a more conservative party, the Democratic Alliance.
The Democratic Alliance, which is led by John Steenhuisen, their policies are more similar to the ANC's policies, but there are certain variants.
The Democratic Alliance is the country's official opposition party. It's historically been popular with white South Africans. The party emphasizes reducing violent crime and the country's crippling debt. Its leader is John Steenhuisen. Here he is responding to President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address in 2022.
We cannot sit through another year of your talk while our country slides further and further backwards and millions more of our citizens fall into poverty and unemployment.
Ramaphosa, for his part, has said he's confident about the ANC's chances.
The ANC is going to win this election outrightly, and with a very clear and decisive majority. So the notion of coalition is not part of the equation.
The possibility of a coalition government would be a situation where no one party had majority control. So to pass reforms, there would likely be lots of negotiation and compromise. If re-elected, Ramaphosa has promised new job creation efforts, a national health insurance plan, and a monthly welfare program to support the country's poorest. But his polling is not looking very good. I asked Ntando, what are the odds of the ANC maintaining their majority?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. We've had a lot of polls come out. The overarching line that we've been hearing is that his party will get, less than 50%. It's very, very difficult to actually pin a figure in terms of whether, or how much he will get. But the consensus is that his party will still remain the main party and will still remain the main policy driver. And that's if there are any significant shifts, or maybe he has to tap other political parties to help the ANC form a government, that is not going to actually, translate into major shifts in governments and how governments is run and, all the policies that they have in place. It won't really have a big effect on policy. So it is a bit of a concern if the ANC doesn't manage to get enough electoral support. If it falls maybe, let's say, to 42% or 40%, which is what some polls are suggesting, then it is in real trouble.
And what that could mean, says Ntando, is that South Africa might not be able to act swiftly and decisively to change its policies.
What that does is that it's a problem for growing the economy and creating employment and fixing the power crisis. And it will also put a burden on public finances because now you've got divergent views about how public finances should be managed.
But Ntando says that for some South Africans, voting for the ANC may still be too tough a pill to swallow. Ntando talked to Mara Koza about how she feels about her choices.
She said for the first time she will actually abstain from voting. And there are a lot of people who actually share her thoughts.
And what could that mean for the election if so many people sit this one out?
I think it's a very complex issue because if a lot of people are saying that they are not coming out to vote, that tells you something about what they think about the other political parties that exist in the country. They're not voting because they have been disappointed. They're not voting because they aren't seeing a viable other option for them. Yet at the same time, the ANC, it can be a headache to them. So that's the sort of dissonance that you find in a lot of people.
Thanks for listening to the Big Take podcast from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. South Africa is only one of many important elections in 2024. This year, voters all around the world will have the ability to affect markets, countries, and economies like never before. To make sense of it all, Bloomberg's created a new podcast series, Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. Each week, listen in as Stephanie Flanders, Bloomberg's head of government and economics coverage, Allegra Stratton, author of Bloomberg's The Readout newsletter, and Bloomberg opinion columnist Adrian Wooldridge help make sense of this consequential election season. Find it in the In the City and Stephanomics feeds. This episode was produced by Jessica Beck and David Fox. It was edited by Stacey Vanek Smith, Mark Daniel Davies, Jessica Loudis, and Neil Munchie. It was mixed by Veronica Rodriguez. It was fact-checked by Thomas Liu and Adriana Tapia. Naomi Shavin and Kim Gittleson are our senior producers. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. Special thanks to Stembile Sele. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week.